NSFW. What is the best NSFW historical fact you know? Lyndon Johnson supposedly got a Secret Serviceman to stand in front because he had to pee and be shielded from view. Lyndon Johnson purposefully peed on the Secret Serviceman's leg knowing full and well he wouldn't budge. F registered sign licks for a French president from 1895 to 1899. Died of a seizure while getting a blowjob. The Pompeii graffiti. It's full of your mom jokes. X ducked Y here. And I it here. Some of my favorites. Theophilus. Don't perform oral sex on girls against the city wall like a dog. I screw the barmaid. Atimitus got me pregnant. Secundus likes to screw boys. I screwed a lot of girls here. Just goes to show you that this kind of humor is universal. Saint Lawrence was martyred on a gridiron. His last words were, "I'm well done on this side. Turn me over." He's now the patron saint of cooks and comedians. I'm not making any of this up. My understanding is that most common folk throughout much of history had very meager lodgings, and most families would sleep together both for warmth as well as the simple fact that they didn't have the space for people to sleep separately. If mom and dad were in the mood to procreate, the rest of the family was just there. The painter John Ruskin supposedly broke up with his wife after seeing her naked because he was too disgusted to consummate the marriage. She then married another artist. It's believed that this is most likely because she had pubic hair, and he didn't realize that was normal because he had only seen nude classical statues and children. Full stop. The ancient city of Alexandria had one of the most famous red light districts, brothels, in the world. Once the prostitutes went on a strike and the economy of the city was at risk, so Cleopatra consulted one of the wise men in the library, and he suggested that they build another district as a competitor. Then they had two districts and the prostitutes of the first district had to end their strike. A teenager in Plymouth Plantation ducked a bunch of farm animals. He was hanged till dead and all the animals were slaughtered. The first vibrating dildo was diesel powered. Not so much as historically as biblical. According to the Bible, right when Jesus is getting arrested by the Romans, a random unnamed naked guy just runs past everyone. He is never mentioned again and it is unknown why they even put in the Bible. It's Mark 14:51-52 if you want to check it out. Mathematician Kurt Gödel suffered from mental illness and was paranoid he was going to be poisoned. He would only eat food his wife had prepared for him. In 1977, she was hospitalized for 6 months and could no longer prepare his food. In her absence, he refused to eat and eventually starved to death. He only weighed 65 pounds when he died. Belarus, World War II. A high-ranking Nazi officer had a brothel concubine set up. Obviously, not consensual. Well, some of the ladies didn't like the situation and didn't like Nazis, so they put a landmine under his mattress. I call it the Belarusian space program. Roman Emperor Commodus had a harem of 300 women and men and spent most of his time there. William the Conqueror allegedly smashed his testicles on the pommel of his horse's saddle, which eventually killed him. But that's not the end of it. During his funeral ceremony, they had placed him in a stone coffin sarcophagus thing. It was unusually hot that day and his body swelled. Well, the coffin did not. So during his funeral, where he died by smashing his nuts, his body exploded. 18th century Empress of Russia Catherine the Great employed foot ticklers to turn her on. In the War for Texas independence against Mexico, after the Battle of the Alamo, there was this Mexican woman who was a spy for Texas. Nicknamed the Yellow Rose of Texas, she went and seduced the Mexican General Santa Anna. And while they were hooking up, the Texans did a surprise attack and slaughtered many Mexicans and won the war. Probably got some facts wrong, lol. George Washington, in his youth, was a handsome, strapping young man that all the women and officers' wives wanted to screw. Our founding father was a bit of a poonhound. Hitler had the hots for his niece Jelly Rorbel, 17-23 years old, who was found dead in her bedroom after she shot herself in the chest with his own gun, noting the fact that she lived with him until 1931. There are a lot of controversial aspects to that story, but also a lot of interesting pieces of information. Some historians speculate that they had a bizarre relationship and that, probably, She was the love of his life. He mourned her death for a week, locked in her bedroom, denied food and wanted to kill himself. After that he kept her room as a shrine and kept her memories with him until near his death. Best? I would not call this best, but it's certainly stuck with me since I learned it in class. In ancient Greece it was believed that if a girl doesn't lose her virginity by her first period, she would fill up with blood to the point where her eyes would turn red, and she would hear voices telling her to jump into wells. Or, at least, it was written in one Greek doctor's writings. There's no real evidence how widely it was believed. Edit. Found the source on this. The past is a crazy place. The one about Gandhi regularly group bathing, group sleeping, cuddling, and getting strip teases and lap dances from really young women. One of which was his grand, or great-grand, I can't recall, niece, to test his sexual restraint or whatever. Lol. A merkin is a replacement wig for pubic hairs prostitutes used to use after they shaved theirs due to pubic lice. After Nero, how can you have a NSFW history thread without naming him? Kicked his wife to death. He met a young boy named Sporus. According to some, Sporus held somewhat of a resemblance to Nero's late, killed, wife, Poppaea, and so Nero had the boy castrated and married him. During the marriage, they appeared in public as a happy couple as Nero paraded his new bride around to Greece and then back to Rome, where he had married another guy named Pythagoras, not the maths guy. Nero called Pythagoras his husband and called Sporus his wife. Sporus was labeled the Empress. A lot of people think that Nero took to Sporus because of the guilt he felt for kicking his wife to death, as he even called Sporus Poppaea, the wife he kicked to death. Needless to say, Nero had issues and his classic NSFW history. He ran the gamut of MFK with his mom, killed his wife, castrated boys who looked like his dead, murdered wife and kept them around for his pleasure guilt, married strong dudes, not that there's anything wrong with that, and ended up killing himself. I'm positive a lot of his history is propaganda, and I recognize how mental illness still goes diagnosed in today's world, not to mention the ancient world. Also, trying to look through the anti-Nero and revisions to find the truth is supremely challenging, but damn, that it is ducked. In 2017, Oscar Wilde was among an estimated 50,000 men who were pardoned for homosexual acts that were no longer considered offenses under the Policing and Crime Act 2017. The act is known informally as the Alan Turing Law. Not that it matters to Mr. Wilde now, but 130 years is a long time to wait to have your name cleared. Don't know if it's true, but my history teacher told me about this one prostitute that got out of dying or something by showing the judges her boobs, claiming it would be against gods to destroy something so beautiful. Fath Ali Shah Qajar, second king in Qajar dynasty in Iran, about 200 years ago, had 160 wives. Nasiruddin Shah Qajar had about 50. In Islam, you're not allowed to marry more than 4 wives at the same time. It is said that Nasiruddin Shah was once walking in his palace and saw a beautiful girl and asked if he could marry her. Everyone was looking at him weirdly and he asked why. One of his servants said that she was his daughter. In the 1840s, England had a parliamentary investigation into women working in coal mines. Not about the frequent deaths, men and women, or the conditions, horrible, working there, and not even that the women worked bare-chested alongside the men, but over the fact that the women wore trousers while doing so. Ottoman Padishah Selim II died by stepping on a soap and falling while chasing girls in his harem. Pretty sure Salvador Dali took imprints of a lot of people's asshole folds and made the shocking discovery that each and every butthole fold that exists is unique in its foldiness. I urge everyone to read James Joyce's love letters. I won't spoil them. An octopus will tear its own cock off only to launch it at a female octopus, and the female will perform a 6-act with the severed member. Mary Shelley lost her virginity on her mother's grave. When Victor Hugo died, all the prostitutes in Paris took a holiday to mourn him. They all got to know him pretty well, if you know what I mean. Napoleon loved the dirty puss. In his letters to Josephine, he instructed her not to bathe for over a month, until he returned home, so he could wallow in the stank. Here is a sampling of his letters, but you can read them in full online. Give it a Google if you want to hear all about the man's love for the lusty ham wallet. The inventor of the modern bra had a dog named Clitoris. Elizabeth Bathory was a countess who lived in the Carpathian Mountains. She was one of the inspirations of Dracula and her nickname was Countess Dracula. She was possibly the most prolific serial killer in history. She believed that blood on her skin made her fresher and younger. She was responsible for the killing of 650 girls. Many were tortured for weeks and were often naked when they were tortured. They were forced to eat their own flesh. She sometimes drank the blood of the girls and stabbed them with needles. Some had their face, hands and private parts burned and bit their flesh and private parts. Many of them starved to death. Others were burned or froze to death naked. She might have eaten some of her servants. It is possible that she bathed in blood. She was never put on trial, but was forced to stay in one room for the rest of her life. She died 4 years later. King Edward II of England was apparently tortured before death, which included shoving a red hot poker up his bum to burn his insides out. Whilst alive. There does remain some debate about this, but I was taught this in school. Chief Buffalo Hump, as he was referred to in English, was not a literal translation of his Comanche name, which was erection that won't go down, Pochanak hip. Cleopatra bathed in spunk. Pedicabo ego vos et iramabo, a classic line of Latin poetry and the first thing I say when people ask me to say something in Latin. It means I'll sodomize and fasciduck you. It was written by the famous poet Catullus, who also did the whole Million Kisses poem everyone needs to translate in Latin class. While receiving oral sex in hot tubs, JFK would hold women's heads underwater during climax. His back pains were so severe Secret Service helped him out of the tub. The oldest known objects that were probably sex toys were made out of stone and animal dung car. 30k years ago. The oldest known objects that were definitely sex toys were anatomically shaped jade and bronze dildos butt plugs dating back to 3000 years. Not to NSFW, but Mozart has a piece of music called Lick My Ass. Large portions of Anne Frank's diary were about periods and masturbation. Hitler's left nut was there, but it was smaller than the right one. Jean-Paul Marat refused to refer to Marie Antoinette by her name in any of his publications. Instead, he simply referred to her as, quote, that Austrian whore. I heard at some point Benjamin Franklin was in a sex cult or something like that. Charles II, Charles the Impotent, was the convergence point for several generations of royal inbreeding and was born with significant disabilities. His parents were desperate for him to produce an heir. They implemented a system of ropes and pulleys to lower virgins onto him in hopes he could impregnate one. It didn't work and the dynasty collapsed. Elagabalus is my favorite. Super young Roman emperor who also was a transsexual prostitute. From Wiki, Cassius Dio reported that Elagabalus would paint his eyes, depilate his body hair and wear wigs before prostituting himself in taverns, brothels, and even in the imperial palace. Finally, he set aside a room in the palace and there committed his indecencies, always standing nude at the door of the room, as the harlots do, and shaking the curtain which hung from gold rings, while in a soft and melting voice he solicited the passers-by. There were, of course, men who had been specially instructed to play their part. For, as in other matters, so in this business, too, he had numerous agents who sought out those who could best please him by their foulness. He would collect money from his patrons and give himself airs over his gains. He would also dispute with his associates in this shameful occupation, claiming that he had more lovers than they and took in more money. Murdered at 18 by his own guards and thrown in the sewer. Then they went so far as to remove his name from all temples and remove all traces of him from society. King Edward VI of England had an apparatus chair. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote a letter to a friend of his detailing how he ducked an ugly old woman after she washed his clothes. Carpetophorus, a Roman gladiator, trained giraffes and other animals to abuse women to entertain the Colosseum crowds. Masturbation was once a prescribed form of relief for female schizophrenia. Mongols used to duck their horses. They liked it so much they even commissioned paintings about it. before Christian missionaries converted them to Christianity. The following was true in the native culture of Papua New Guinea. It was believed that the essence of manliness or machismo was contained in a man's semen. Therefore, young boys who were about to go through puberty were encouraged to swallow as much of it as possible. And they did. Hey, it was part of their culture. Who are you to judge? Source: Psych 101 textbook talking about the relativity of social norms. An example of what Westerners would consider shocking and wrong but was normal in those tribes. That Aboriginal Australians would dispose of unwanted babies by filling their mouths full of sand and leaving them to die. I remember reading something like Hans Christian Andersen kept a masturbation diary, often visited prostitutes just to chat, after which he masturbated and then wrote about it, was possibly bi, and likely died a virgin. I want to say that there is a theory or something that The Little Mermaid was inspired by a man that HCA loved, but who didn't love him. Not entirely NSFW or sourced, but you know. During Qing dynasties in China, 1644-1911, the imperial bureaucracy employed thousands of eunuchs. They were emasculated using a curved knife, and both their testicles and D were removed. This emasculation process left the eunuchs unable to control their bladders, and they would piss themselves without warning. They developed such a reputation for malodorousness that there's still a Mandarin saying stinky as a eunuch. The eunuchs placed their now removed genitalia in a special sealed container called a bao, which was then placed on a high shelf. When the eunuch died and was buried, the bao was entombed alongside, as they believed they would be born into the afterlife with their genitalia reattached. Composer Percy Grainger left the chests in his final days to be opened at a date years beyond his death. The chest contained BDSM equipment as well as numerous nudes of him being tied up and exposing his lashings. He included a note about how he was worried about being rejected due to his sexual habits, but knew that the world would find out at some point. He hangs dong. During World War I, French prostitutes with syphilis charged more money than non-infected ones. Contracting syphilis was some kind of blessing for the soldiers, because they would be sent to the hospital for 30 days, escaping the harsh living conditions of the trenches. If you pissed off the Roman Emperor Caracalla, he would sleep with your wife and then tell the details of the encounter the next day. Sometimes during his dinner parties he would excuse himself with the wife of an attendee, duck her and then rejoin the party and explain everything that just happened with her husband sitting right there, just because he could, I guess. In ancient Greece, prostitutes used to press "follow me" into their sandals so that when they walked it would imprint into the dirt or sand. So when people saw it they'd know that they could follow the trail and it would end in a prostitute and maybe some sex. There's a sculpture I love called the Slipper Slapper that shows Aphrodite and Pan, and she is, edit, my bad this is not true, holding a sandal with "follow me" on the bottom. Big edit, sorry. I appear to have misunderstood a professor and then didn't follow up before posting. The Slipper Slapper is a beautiful sculpture, but does not have "follow me" studded on the bottom in Greek. My bad for not researching the statue more before posting. In 1820s Scotland, medical cadavers were in such high demand and worth so much money that two men, William Burke and William Hare, went into business together murdering people and selling the bodies to local universities. By the time their scheme was uncovered, 16 people had been killed. Wikipedia link. Edit. So now my top 2 posts are about a pair of serial killers and the time that the Count from Sesame Street was accidentally referred to by a profane name. That seems about right. In ancient Egypt, a god's wife was an honor typically given to high priestesses or pharaoh's first wife, the queen. This honor was solely for the woman to devote a part of her morning to pleasuring a pure golden statue of a god, typically Amun when this was practiced, although many other gods received the same treatment. That's right folks, the most elite women of ancient Egypt ducked a gold statue every morning from a range of 12 to whenever they died. Author James Joyce wrote love letters to his wife that were filled with some really interesting stuff. Here's an excerpt. You had an ass full of farts that night, darling, and I ducked them out of you. Big fat fellows, long windy ones, quick little merry cracks and a lot of tiny little naughty farters ending in a long gush from your hole. It is wonderful to duck a farting woman when every duck drives one out of her. I think I would know Nora's fart anywhere. I think I could pick hers out in a room full of farting women. Here's some more. Enjoy. How has no one spoken about Samuel Prescott? Paul Revere got the equivalent of being pulled over on his midnight ride when Samuel Prescott was on his own midnight ride. If you know what I'm saying. He saw Revere pulled over, put on some pants, and continued to warn that the British were coming. My history professor said one of his students said it was the most important booty call in history, so there's that. Ben Franklin was a dirty old man. He would sit at windows, fully nude, and flirt with nearly every woman that crossed his path. He also frequented brothels. Lyndon Johnson had a comically large D that he would whip out in public with no provocation, going back and forth with the Kennedys. He once whipped out his D to prove he had no reason to be intimidated by them. I was pretty surprised when I found out samurai would have consensual homosexual relationships with their apprentices. The younger man would even dress like a woman. Also, feudal Japanese pictures had some pretty massive cocks. It used to be common 200 plus years ago for young boys to get hand jobs from their nannies before bedtime. Why didn't we live 200 years ago? Dr. John C. Lilly, the first guy to realize dolphins are super smart, had a woman live with one for 10 weeks. He thought that 10 weeks was just enough time for a dolphin to be taught to speak English, which would be key when alien life came to Earth and they needed to learn how to communicate. He, naturally, thought acid would help this process, so he dosed the dolphin a bunch. Turns out the dolphin was super horny, unclear as to whether it was from the English lessons or the acid, and started getting real frisky with the woman he was living with. She jacked him off a bunch. He stuck his snout around her crotch. It was real romantic. Nothing really happened after, except the woman ended up marrying the photographer for the experiment. Oh, and the US Navy funded the whole thing. Probably NSFW for Americans, but late Australian Prime Minister from the 70s Gough Whitlam once had this exchange with an opposition member during Parliament. Opposition: I'm a country member. Gough: I remember. Boobs as we know them have existed for about 200,000 years. Weird boob things on varying degrees of human-like creatures have existed for 2 million years. As of today there are 7.7 billion people on the planet. That's 3.85 billion pairs of boobs to choose from. That's 485 square miles of goddamned titties. Shah Sultan Hussein Safavi, last king of Safavid Empire in Iran, was a super sex addict. Apparently he had sex with some thousands of women, and deflowered many girls. It depends on how you define NSFW, but it's said that when Parthia captured the Roman general Crassus they poured liquid gold down his throat. Roman bouts on their 16th birthday would be given a male prostitute, who would then teach them essentially how to be a top. After marriage, the prostitute would stay with the family as a servant. Often, this prostitute was also passed down from father to son. I'm kind of disappointed by the lack of OSHA facts. The term beaver comes from colonial times when prostitutes would use a beaver pelt to cover themselves due to shaving off their pubic hair because they had crabs. In the Old Testament Torah, the Asherah poles that were condemned by God were just giant wooden deities that were erected, pun totally intended, to worship Asherah. Then they would have a sex next to them on the high places to basically be pornography for the gods to see so they could get in the mood and get it on themselves. Guess what the rain was?